The quiet ones are always dangerous, Dr. Sterling had read somewhere, but he didn't believe it. Dangerous people made noise. They climbed ladders, networked at galas, put their names on office doors. Dangerous people looked like him. The night shift nurse in the ICU who kept her head down and volunteered for the worst assignments didn't look dangerous. She looked tired. Competent, sure. Steady-handed during the codes when everyone else's pulse climbed into the 140s. But dangerous? He would remember her name if she had one worth remembering, and by 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in Norfolk, Katie Rodriguez was just another RN on a hospital payroll that cost Mercy General too much already. She moved through the ICU corridors like someone accustomed to moving unseen. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless drone overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that killed color and shadow equally. Antiseptic and floor wax mixed in the recycled air, a smell Katie had learned to breathe through years ago. Other smells lingered underneath, the copper and salt signature of human breakdown, the sweet decay of bodies failing in slow motion, the desperate chemistry of people trying to stay alive. She had smelled worse. Much worse. But she didn't let her face show it. Room for 12 was stable for now. Room for 08 needed vitals in 20 minutes. The medication cart sat at the nurse's station, organized with the kind of precision that came from knowing how fragile order actually was. Katie signed into the electronic system and began her rounds, her badge clipped to the pocket of her scrubs with the name tag facing inward. A small thing. A habit that stuck. The eagle, globe and anchor on her cracked travel mug went mostly unnoticed too, just another piece of generic hospital merchandise, like the pens that disappeared and the stethoscopes people borrowed and never returned. The morning rounds came at 6:33 a.m., which meant they came early. Dr. Sterling swept through the unit like a man who owned it, his white coat pressed with the kind of precision that suggested professional laundry service. Behind him came the residents, the interns, the medical students, the usual hierarchy of people learning how to think like him. Katie pulled up the medication charts on the screen at the main station and waited. She had learned to wait. Waiting was something she was very good at. Saline drip for patient for 12, Sterling announced, glancing at the chart one of the residents handed him. Adjusted for age and comorbidities. Cost? The resident scrolled. $847, doctor. Katie's jaw tightened. Just slightly. A small muscle movement that most people wouldn't catch. Most people wouldn't know to look for it. She kept her eyes on the chart in front of her, on the data that shouldn't have been there. A basic for saline drip cost approximately $3 to acquire. The inflation wasn't accidental. Inflation this precise, this consistent, suggested pattern. Intent. Money that disappeared into somewhere before it reached the hospital's accounts and then appeared somewhere else. She raised her hand. The movement was soft, a small gesture that said excuse me, not I have a problem. Deferential. Cautious. Exactly what she had trained herself to be in the 3 years since Norfolk. Since disappearing. Yes? Sterling turned his attention to her like a spotlight finding movement in darkness. The saline protocol for Medicare patients is the standard bag, no custom additives, Katie said, keeping her voice level and even. I can double-check the pharmacy charges, but this seems elevated compared to last week's costs. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Sterling smiled. It was the kind of smile that had probably worked well on people who didn't understand what smiling actually meant. I'm sure the pharmacy knows what they're doing, Ms. Rodriguez. Unless you've suddenly acquired a degree in cost accounting alongside your RN license. No, doctor. Then I'd suggest you focus on the nursing. His eyes held hers for a moment, the briefest assessment, like a predator checking whether something was worth hunting. Then he moved on, his entourage flowing behind him like water around a stone. Katie watched the back of his white coat disappear into the next room and released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The day shift was changing by 7:38 a.m. Katie grabbed her jacket from the break room and headed for the parking lot. The morning was already hot, Norfolk humidity pressing down like a physical thing. Her car was a 2009 Honda Civic, registered under the name she'd been given, blue as 1,000 other cars in Virginia. She unlocked the driver's side and reached for the glove compartment, her hand moving with the kind of automatic precision that came from muscle memory older than sleep. The combat boots lay in a plastic bin underneath the emergency supplies. Size 7. Desert tan with the original laces still threaded through the eyelets, laces that had been tied in Ramadi and never retired since. The leather still held dust from the streets where half her team had left pieces of themselves behind. Her fingers traced the worn creases where the boots had molded themselves to her feet, to her movements, to the weight of carrying people too wounded to carry themselves. She didn't look at the boots long. Just long enough to remember, and remembering was only useful in the dark, only at 3 a.m. when her brain insisted on waking her up to consider how many people were still in the ground because she hadn't been fast enough or smart enough or had missed one small detail in a surveillance pattern that might have changed everything. Katie closed the glove compartment and started the engine. Her phone buzzed at 2:17 p.m. while she was asleep. The text came through on the encrypted phone, the one she kept in the kitchen cabinet behind the rice, the one that was only supposed to ring if protocol had been broken and everything needed to evacuate or explode or both. But the text wasn't an alert. It was from her son. Mom. My CO got reassigned. Coming through Norfolk next week for debriefing. Thought you should know since it's close. Love you. The name was there too. Major Michael Carson. She had heard her son mention him maybe twice in the 3 years since deployment. Twice in phone calls where her son was checking boxes, staying in contact with the mother he'd promised he would, knowing she worked at the hospital and knowing she'd want to know that his commanding officer, the man who kept him alive in the places she couldn't reach anymore, would be in her city. She didn't have another hospital in Norfolk. She had this one. Mercy General, where she had built a careful life around a carefully controlled identity and a job she was good at because being good at keeping people alive was something she had trained for before she was old enough to vote. Katie set the phone down on the kitchen counter and made coffee she didn't want, just something to do with her hands. The apartment was small, a bedroom, a kitchen that opened into a living room, a bathroom where the hot water pressure was weak and the pipes sang. She had chosen it because it was close to the hospital and far from the kind of people who would recognize her. The furniture was minimal. No photos. No evidence of the person she'd been before Norfolk, before the Pentagon had called a room full of people and used the word misadventure and given her a new social security number and an instruction to disappear. The text from her son stayed on the counter next to the coffee. The ICU was short-staffed on Wednesday night. 2 nurses called in sick, and Sterling approved exactly 0 transfers from the day shift to cover the gap. Katie worked the first 4 hours solo, then Marissa came in at midnight and split the load. Marissa was new, less than a year on the unit, and she still looked shocked when patients crashed instead of horrified. Katie watched her during the rounds and said nothing about it. She was changing a post-op dressing in room 406 when she heard Sterling's voice in the hallway, loud enough to be deliberate. He was with 2 of the residents, pointing to the medication board where the night shift logged their activities. Katie's hands kept moving, antiseptic wipe, old dressing off, new dressing applied with the kind of precision that came from understanding that a wrong millimeter could mean infection, which meant complications, which meant a patient who lived spent an extra week in the hospital fighting something that should have been preventable. See this? Sterling was saying. Rodriguez ordered 50 micrograms of fentanyl for patient for 08 last shift. The chart shows he was stable. No pain complaints. That's either incompetence or she's stealing. Katie's hands continued moving. Tape. Clean edge. Done. She sealed the dressing and straightened up, maintaining her posture, maintaining her breathing. The pattern she had learned when she was 22 years old and learning how to keep her heart rate at 60 beats per minute while watching buildings burn in Ramadi. She didn't look toward the hallway. She didn't acknowledge that his words existed or mattered or that she could hear them. She simply finished her work and moved to the next room like nothing had been said. Like she hadn't just heard him establish the first brick of whatever wall he was building. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was walking past the medication board on her way to the next chart and seeing that Sterling had printed out the medication log and posted it for everyone to see, a laminated page with her initials highlighted in yellow, the fentanyl order circled 3 times in red marker. A medication error. Documented. Visible. The kind of thing that could be explained if anyone asked, but no one would ask. No one asked because asking meant getting involved, and getting involved meant being next. Katie walked past the board without slowing her pace and pulled up the next patient's chart. The night continued. More vitals. More dressings. More bodies in numbered rooms fighting against the universal direction toward stillness. Somewhere around 4 a.m., when the unit was quietest and the only sound was the collective breathing of machines keeping people alive, the admission board updated. Room for 12. Major Michael Carson, Special Forces. Expected arrival 1,400 hours Thursday. The world didn't shift. The lights didn't flicker. No alarm sounded to warn her that everything personal had just collided with everything dangerous about the work she did. Katie simply pulled up the new chart and read the admitting diagnosis. Routine. Scheduled. The kind of thing that happened every day in hospitals across the country. And then she realized that her son's commanding officer, the man whose decisions kept her son breathing, was walking through her hospital's doors in 14 hours, and the man who was building a file on her, brick by brick, was the same man who would see that file and decide what it meant. The shift ended at 7 a.m. Katie clocked out and walked to her car without seeing anyone or anything except the dust in her memory, the boots in her glove compartment, and the space of time between now and Thursday at 1,400 hours, 14 hours where anything could be prepared, positioned, or destroyed. The shift papers were waiting on the bulletin board at 1,900 hours. Katie saw them before she even clocked in, her name in red ink, flagged at the top of the assignment sheet. Room for 12. Major Carson. Stable vitals, training accident, wife and teenage son at bedside. She read it once. Memorized it. Moved on. Dr. Sterling was already in the corridor when she passed the medication dispensary, his white coat crisp as fresh dollar bills, his voice carrying that particular timbre of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was on his phone, laughing about something, a country club, maybe, or a stock tip. Katie didn't listen. She never listened to Sterling if she could help it. Room for 12 was at the end of the East Wing, past the nurses' station where 3 staff members suddenly became very absorbed in their charting. Katie pushed the door open, her stethoscope already around her neck, her hand steady as a surgical laser, ready to check the major's for sights and blood pressure cuff. The lights in the room were dimmed for the patient's comfort. Major Carson lay unconscious, his breathing even, his chest rising and falling in the controlled rhythm of sedation wearing off. His wife sat in the corner chair, reading glasses slipped down her nose, a paperback open on her lap but unread. His son, 17, maybe 18, stood at the foot of the bed, jaw locked, eyes red-rimmed from a night of worry that had nothing to do with his father's body and everything to do with what that body represented. Command. Duty. The possibility of loss. Katie nodded to them both. Just going to check his vitals, she said quietly. Won't take a minute. She was reaching for the blood pressure cuff when Sterling appeared in the doorway like something that had crawled out from under a rock. His presence made the air pressure change. The door swung shut behind him with the soft hydraulic hiss of the room's closing mechanism, and suddenly the space felt smaller, meaner, occupied by something with teeth. Mrs. Carson, Sterling said, his voice pitched loud enough to carry, loud enough to wound. I apologize that Rodriguez is assigned to your husband. She's one of those nurses who couldn't cut it anywhere else, so she ends up on night shift where she can't do too much damage. The words landed like shrapnel. Katie's hand paused on the blood pressure cuff. The rubber bladder was cold beneath her palm. Around her, the machines beeped their steady rhythms, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, the cardiac monitor's digital percussion, the 4 pumps' quiet clicking. All of it suddenly very loud. All of it suddenly very small. She took one measured breath. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her fingers were steady as she wrapped the cuff around the Major's arm, as she pressed the button to initiate the automatic cycle, as she watched the numbers inflate and read them off, 118/74. Normal. Stable. Clean. A single tear escaped her left eye. She didn't feel it form. Didn't feel it slide down her cheek. She only became aware of it when the salt touched her skin, the body's betrayal, the involuntary sting of things held down for too long finally finding a crack in the armor. She reached up with the back of her hand and wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Without looking away. Without flinching. "I've cut it in places you couldn't survive, Doctor," she said. Her voice had dropped half an octave. The words came out clean and clear and final, the way a judge says guilty, the way a firing squad commander gives the order. Not loud. Not angry. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing exactly what you're capable of. Sterling's face went from tan to red in maybe 2 seconds. The kind of sudden flush that suggests blood vessels working overtime, adrenaline flooding a system that wasn't built for being challenged by someone who wasn't supposed to talk back. "That attitude is exactly what I mean," he said, his voice climbing now, losing its practice smoothness. "Insubordination. Right here in front of Mrs. Carson and her son. This is what I'm talking about." Katie said nothing. She simply finished documenting the blood pressure reading on the chart, then checked the foresight. The catheter was clean, no sign of infiltration, the line running clear and steady into the Major's arm. She made a note, patient stable, vitals within normal limits, for patent, sedation appropriate. The Major's son was staring at her. Not the way people usually stared at nurses. The way soldiers stare at other soldiers when something unspoken has just been confirmed in their brain, some frequency of recognition that only certain people could hear. His mother was watching Sterling's face turn colors, her fingers tightening on the paperback she'd been pretending to read all evening. The Major himself remained unconscious, undisturbed by the small violence that had just occurred at the foot of his bed. Sterling turned and left without another word. The door hissed shut behind him. Katie completed her patient assessment, heart rate 68, oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters nasal cannula, pupils equal and reactive, neuro exam intact. Everything was good. The Major was doing exactly what he should be doing. His body was healing itself, following the protocols written into human biology over millions of years of evolution. "He's looking better," Katie said to Mrs. Carson, and meant it. "His vitals are strong. You should rest if you can. I'll monitor him through the night." She left the room and didn't go to the break room or the supply closet or anywhere people might be. She went straight to the medication dispensary and checked the controlled substance logs, cross-referencing the times and doses against the patients they'd been administered to. Everything was accounted for. Everything was clean. She knew it would be. She hadn't been off the unit during her last shift, she'd been charting in the break room when 0400 hours came and went, visible to anyone who'd bothered to look. But when she arrived the next morning at 1900 hours and checked the unit bulletin board, there it was anyway. Posted in the center where every staff member would see it before the day's shift ended. Nurse Rodriguez, medication error, wrong dosage documented 0400 hours. Chart flagged for review. Incident report filed. Katie stared at it for 5 seconds. Not longer. 5 seconds was all she allowed herself. Then she turned and walked to the supply room, where the boxes of saline bags and latex gloves and alcohol swabs lived in neat rows under the kind of fluorescent lights that had never known peace. 3 nurses had seen her looking at the posting. 3 nurses immediately found reasons to be elsewhere. The hallway cleared like someone had pulled a plug. By 0300 hours that night, word had spread through the unit with the speed of active infection. Careless. Reckless. One of those nurses. Katie ate her sandwich alone in the break room, watching the empty chairs around the small table where 4 people had been sitting 20 minutes ago. They'd grabbed their food and left without a word, no eye contact, no excuse, just the collective decision that proximity to Katie was contagious. The sandwich tasted like cardboard. The coffee tasted like failure. The silence tasted like being slowly erased from a place where you'd worked for 8 years. Her phone buzzed. A text from her son: "Major Carson is the best CO I've ever had. If anything happened to him." She stared at the incomplete sentence. Started to type back. "He's going to be fine." She got halfway through that before she deleted it. Deleted the whole conversation thread. Put the phone face down on the table. The thing about being invisible is that nobody sees it happening. You just disappear in degrees, fade like a photograph left in sunlight, become something that people's eyes naturally slid past without registering. Katie had done it once before. She could do it again. But that night, around 2,200 hours, Sterling appeared at her assignment station with Marcus Webb, a man in a charcoal suit who carried a leather portfolio the way some men carry weapons. Webb was a healthcare consultant, supposedly the kind of professional that hospitals brought in when they needed to build airtight termination cases. Webb's eyes moved across Katie's face like he was reading a file, cataloging details, building a profile. He said nothing to her directly. He just nodded to Sterling and made a note in his portfolio. Then, at 2,145 hours on the following shift, Sterling called her into the medication room. "Effective immediately, you're reassigned," he said. His voice had settled back into its smooth operating rhythm, the way a knife slides back into its sheath after drawing blood. "You're making the Carson family uncomfortable with your intensity. Jenkins will take over room for 12. Katie opened her mouth to say something. To ask why. To point out that she'd been assigned to that room, that she'd been professional, that Major Carson's vitals had been solid and his foresight had been clean. But she closed her mouth instead. She nodded once and walked to the supply closet, where she stood in the dark for 3 minutes, forcing her breathing down, forcing her heart rate down, forcing everything down into the deep compartment where she kept the parts of herself that could never surface. When she came out, there were 3 missed calls on her phone. A Pentagon prefix. A number that didn't officially exist. She didn't call back. She'd been ordered never to surface. But the major knew who she was, and people who knew who she was didn't just forget. The night shift continued. The machines beeped. The lights hummed their endless frequency. And Katie Rodriguez, the night shift nurse who couldn't cut it anywhere else, stayed invisible and waited for whatever was coming next. The monitor alarm at 0145 sounds like a scream that won't stop, and Katie knows that sound, has heard it before in places where the screaming meant someone was already dead, they just hadn't stopped moving yet. She's in the supply room 3 corridors away, restocking crash carts for the night shift rotation, when the code announcement crackles through the overhead speaker, code blue, room for 12. Her hands freeze on the defibrillator pads she's arranging in their plastic slots. Room for 12 is the Major's room. The Major whose son deployed 6 months ago under the exact same commanding officer whose name is burned into Katie's memory like a scar that won't fade, like muscle memory from wars that officially never happened. She moves without deciding to move. Feet carry her down the corridor in a walk that looks unhurried to anyone watching, but her pulse is already climbing, already priming her body for what comes next. 63 steps from the supply room to the ICU wing. She counts them automatically, old habit, tactical habit, the kind of counting that kept operators alive when the noise got too loud to think. The night shift nurses scatter as she approaches room for 12, stepping aside without question, their eyes widening slightly at the set of her jaw, at the way she moves through space like someone accustomed to moving through chaos. She's supposed to be off Major Carson's care. Dr. Sterling made that abundantly clear during rounds, reassigning her to trauma intake after his public humiliation yesterday, making certain she wouldn't be anywhere near the officer or his family. But codes don't follow the reassignment sheets, and Katie has learned long ago that protocols are suggestions made by people who've never held a dying operator's intestines together with their bare hands while waiting for a medevac that won't arrive in time. The room is a symphony of failure. The monitor screams its flatline rhythm while the ventilator hisses like a mechanical animal choking on something lodged in its throat. Major Carson's chest wall is rigid, visibly rigid, like someone's driven a crowbar through his ribs and left it there to rust. His trachea has deviated sharply to the left, a detail that would be invisible to most people in this room but is a neon sign to Katie, screaming a diagnosis: tension pneumothorax. Air has collapsed the left lung and is pressing against his heart like a hand slowly closing into a fist. His oxygen saturation reads 82% on the monitor, dropping with each failed breath the ventilator tries to push into compromised lungs. 78%. 75%. The hemodynamic clock is running down and it's running fast. Nurse Jenkins stands at the bedside frozen, her hands hovering above the 4 lines as if she's forgotten what hands are supposed to do, her mouth forming words that don't quite reach sound. Mrs. Carson is in the corner gripping the back of a chair that isn't there, her knuckles white against something only she can see. The teenage son, the major's son, who carries his father's eyes and his father's broad shoulders but none of his father's training, stands rigid as a sentry, his utilities still bearing the dust of whatever base he came from, watching his father's oxygen numbers spiral downward like a pilot watching an instrument panel fail. Then Sterling arrives, pushing the crash cart like he's navigating a crowded hallway at a medical conference rather than moving toward a dying patient. He stops in the doorway, assessing, and Katie sees it in the small hesitation of his shoulders, in the barely perceptible tilt of his head. He's calculating. Not the medical emergency in front of him, but the angles of this moment, the fact that a special forces officer is dying in his hospital on the night shift, the fact that the officer's son is watching, the fact that if the major dies, there won't be a commanding officer's family pressing questions about whether Sterling missed something, about whether his retaliation against the night shift nurse cost a patient his life. Dead patients are convenient. Dead officers less so. Sterling moves to the cart with the crash medications, fumbling slightly with the decompression kit, the 14-gauge catheter needle that's supposed to be this patient's salvation, the tool that will release the compressed air and let his heart beat again. He's not rushing. Katie watches him move, watches the deliberate slowness of his hands, and every instinct she has, instincts honed across 12 years in the military, 3 deployments into places where hesitation meant funerals, every instinct screams that Sterling is timing this moment, measuring it, deciding whether saving the major is in his interest. "Doctor, he needs immediate needle decompression," Katie says. Her voice doesn't shake. Her hands don't reach for the kit. She states the medical reality like she's reading a weather report, but every muscle in her body has already started moving toward what comes next. His oxygen saturation is dropping at 4% per breath cycle. "We have minutes." "I'm assessing," Sterling snaps, still moving with that poisoned slowness toward the major's bedside. "Stand back. You're not assigned to this patient." 60 seconds pass. The monitor shows 76% oxygen saturation. The alarm screams louder. Mrs. Carson makes a sound that isn't quite human, a mother watching her husband die in real time while a doctor named Sterling moves like he's shopping for groceries. The teenager's eyes snap to Katie, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, and in that glance is the same recognition she saw when she first walked into Ramadi 17 years ago, the knowledge that someone in the room knows what they're doing, and everyone else is just playing dress-up. Sterling positions himself between Katie and the patient, his body blocking her line of sight, his hands finally, reaching for the decompression kit. But his hands are shaking now. Not from fear. From rage. From the realization that if this patient survives, if the major wakes up and speaks and identifies Katie as the one who saved him, everything Sterling has built, the hospital board connections, the insurance billing schemes, the careful architecture of retaliation, all of it cracks. "Doctor, step aside or he dies." Katie's voice has changed. The deferential night shift nurse is gone. In her place stands someone else, someone whose presence makes the air in the room pressure shift, makes even the monitors seem to pause their screaming for a breath. That's not a suggestion. "Step aside." Sterling doesn't move. "You are not authorized." Katie pushes past him. Not roughly. Precisely. Her shoulder grazes his arm, a movement so controlled it's almost gentle, but it displaces him from the patient's bedside like he weighs nothing. Her hands are already moving, muscle memory reaching back to Ramadi, to a forward operating base where a medic named Foster had taught her how to perform needle decompression when the battalion surgeon was 6 hours away and operators were dying in sequence like dominoes falling. Foster is in Arlington now, under a marble headstone with a date that stops in 2010. But his hands live on in Katie's hands. She grabs the 14-gauge catheter from the crash cart. Her fingers find the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark that marks the difference between life and death. The needle slides between the ribs with barely any resistance, skin, intercostal fascia, pleural space, and then the hiss. A perfect, unmistakable hiss of pressurized air escaping, the sound of a pneumothorax decompressing, the sound of salvation. The major's chest wall softens. Visibly softens, like someone released a pneumatic vice. His trachea shifts back to midline in real time, the deviation straightening as the pressure inside his chest equalizes. The oxygen saturation climbs, 81%, 85%, 91%, pushing higher with each breath the ventilator delivers into lungs that are finally, inflating properly. The monitor trace transforms from flatline chaos into the elegant rhythm of a heartbeat that wants to keep living. The major gasps. His eyes flutter open, unfocused at first, then locking onto Katie's face as she stands over him, her hand still steady on the needle, her breathing as controlled as a sniper's trigger finger. For 3 seconds they stare at each other, and Katie watches recognition bloom across his features, not recognition of her face, but recognition of something deeper, something that has nothing to do with hospital badges or shift assignments. His lips move. His voice comes out rough as gravel, barely a whisper. Reaper. Only Katie hears it. Her call sign. The designation she hasn't heard spoken aloud in 17 years, the title that belongs to someone who pulled wounded operators out of kill zones with rounds still snapping overhead, who left parts of herself in Ramadi and never went back to collect them. Her call sign, which means exactly 6 people on Earth should know her real identity, and Major Michael Carson, unconscious moments ago, drowning in his own collapsed lung, should not be one of them. Sterling's face has drained to the color of old parchment. His hands, which had trembled with rage a moment earlier, now hang useless at his sides. He's watching Katie's hands, watching the way she moves with a precision that belongs to someone trained in killing, in saving, in operating under conditions that would break most people into very small pieces. He's watching her, and something in his face shifts, a recalibration, a sudden and terrible understanding that he has been treating the wrong kind of enemy, that the night shift nurse he's been systematically destroying has just saved his career by saving a patient he was willing to let die. Jenkins is crying softly, her hand over her mouth. Mrs. Carson is pressing her palms against her eyes. The teenager hasn't moved, hasn't blinked, his eyes still locked on Katie like she's just become the most important person in the room, which she absolutely has. Katie carefully withdraws the needle, her movement still controlled, still precise, her mind already 3 steps ahead, running through what comes next, what this moment will cost her, what happens when a dead call sign suddenly breathes again. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. By 0600, the badge didn't scan. Katie stood at the medication room entrance, her security credentials rejected by the system 3 times in succession. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like an irritating hum, mechanical and indifferent. She'd been a night shift nurse for 18 months. Her badge had never failed. She called down to security. The voice on the other end, a woman named Patricia whom Katie had treated with respect 100 times over, went very quiet. "There's a note on your file. You're on administrative leave pending investigation. You need to go home." The words landed like concrete. Not a suspension. Not a review. A deactivation. Sterling had moved fast. Predictably fast. By 0800, Sterling assembled his 3 board members in the conference room on the 2nd floor. Judge Hammond, who'd received Sterling's referral for her arthroscopic knee surgery and paid him a professional courtesy fee of $8,000 that somehow never appeared in hospital billing. Thomas Whitmore, the CFO, who benefited from Sterling's Medicare billing markup by roughly $400,000 annually across his surgical department. and Marcus Webb, the newly hired independent investigator from Atlanta, whose consulting firm had a contract with Sterling worth $127,000 per fiscal year. They didn't call it a conspiracy. They called it network. The door locked behind Sterling. On the table in front of each board member lay a manila folder. Sterling opened his own and began speaking in the low, measured tone of a man performing concern. "Senior Chief Rodriguez," he said, then caught himself with a thin smile. "I mean, Nurse Rodriguez. Last night she performed a procedure she is not credentialed to perform. She physically pushed me away from my patient. This is textbook insubordination. More than that, it's a patient safety violation." Judge Hammond didn't look up. Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly. Webb, the investigator, leaned forward. "What procedure?" "Emergency needle decompression. A tension pneumothorax in Major Carson's chest. She performed it without authorization, without my presence, well, without my supervision." The last word carried a weight that made the room settle. "The procedure was appropriate," Webb said quietly. "The patient's oxygen saturation was critically low." "Which is precisely my point," Sterling continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man who'd rehearsed this conversation. "She abandoned her assignment to another unit, disobeyed my direct order to step back from that patient, and made a treatment decision that, while clinically sound, bypassed the chain of command entirely. If we allow this behavior, we have no structure. No authority. No hospital." By 0900, Webb had finished his preliminary report. A pattern of boundary violations, he read from his notes, looking at each board member in turn. Emotional instability. Last night's unauthorized intervention against a physician's direct orders. The nursing staff has documented her as isolated, dismissive of hierarchy, and increasingly unstable. The words were surgical. Precise. Lethal. None of them were true. All of them were documented. Sterling had been building this file for 6 weeks. Every minor deviation. Every question about medication charges. Every moment she'd spoken with the authority of someone who'd actually saved lives in places that required saving them. By 1000, Katie was called into the conference room. She walked in dry, composed, her scrub still slightly damp from the rain she'd stood in at the bus stop the night before. Sterling sat at the head of the table like a captain at his own trial. Webb to his left. Judge Hammond staring at her folder. Whitmore checking his phone with the practiced indifference of a man who'd already decided the outcome. Sterling began. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately for gross insubordination and patient safety concerns." The sentence landed like a closing door. Katie sat perfectly still. The room's silence was the kind that comes from knowing something irreversible has just happened. She didn't tremor. Didn't pale. Her hands rested flat on the table. "I saved Major Carson's life," she said. Her voice was steady. Level. The voice of someone stating a fact. Webb shifted slightly. "You physically pushed a physician and performed a procedure without authorization. In any hospital in America, that's grounds for immediate termination and license review." His tone suggested sympathy, which made it worse. Katie stood without another word. She looked at Judge Hammond, who suddenly became fascinated with the edge of the table. She looked at Whitmore, who looked away first. She looked at Sterling, and in that moment, her eyes held something that made him lean back slightly in his chair. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Something that had seen worse than conference rooms. She turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft hydraulic sigh. By 1800, a security guard named Miller escorted her to the employee exit. Miller had worked at Mercy General for 11 years. He'd watched Katie calm patients in crisis, work double shifts without complaint, save a teenager's life in the parking lot when a construction accident took a turn south. He handed her a cardboard box. The edges were already softening from the humidity. Inside, a cracked mug with an eagle, globe, and anchor pressed into the ceramic. A dying succulent in a small plastic pot, the leaves brown and curling but still clinging to life. And a photograph. 8 faces. Her team from Ramadi. Charlie Platoon, 3rd SFOD Delta. The image was 6 years old. 4 of those faces were in Arlington now. Buried under classifications and redactions and flags that folded into triangles. Miller didn't say anything unnecessary. "I'm sorry, Rodriguez. You were the best nurse we had." Katie nodded once. Just once. She took the box and walked into the rain. The bus stop was 3 blocks down, at the corner of Princess and 22nd Street. She stood there with the cardboard box growing softer in her hands, watching buses drive past with their doors closed. The 7:40 p.m. bus was cancelled. The 8:10 p.m. bus didn't come. By 19:15, the rain had soaked through the cardboard. The photo inside was getting wet. The succulent was probably dead, really dead this time, not just dying. She could have gone home. Called someone. The Pentagon number that had called yesterday was still in her recent calls. She didn't call. She just stood at the bus stop watching the hospital 3 blocks away, its windows lit up like 1,000 eyes, all of them turning away from her. At 19:40, when the next bus should have arrived, nothing came. She was alone at an empty stop in Norfolk, Virginia, wearing hospital scrubs soaked through with rain, holding a cardboard box that contained everything she had left of her real life. The fluorescent lights of the bus shelter hummed their mechanical song. A car passed, spraying water. No one stopped. No one asked if she needed help. The hospital lights blurred through her tears and the rain, becoming something abstract and unreachable. She kept standing there because standing there was easier than moving. Because moving would mean accepting that she'd lost everything twice, once in Ramadi when they classified her entire existence, and now here, in the rain, at a bus stop that nobody was coming to. She wondered if this was what disappearing was supposed to feel like. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just slow. Gradual. Like drowning in the open air, invisible to everyone passing by, wondering if anyone would ever know she'd been there at all. The rain came down harder. She didn't move. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another Pentagon number, a different one, but she didn't answer. Some calls came too late. By the time they rang, you were already gone. The knock came at 0630, before Katie had finished her first cup of coffee. She didn't open the door yet. Through the peephole she saw a young man in army utilities, sandy hair, jaw set with purpose. He looked like every operator she'd served with, the kind of posture that came from knowing exactly what you could do and exactly what it would cost. She opened the door. He didn't wait for invitation. "My father woke up an hour ago," he said. His voice carried the clipped precision of military speech. First thing he said. One word. "Reaper." The coffee cup slipped from Katie's hand. It shattered on the kitchen tile, pieces scattering across the floor in a pattern that looked deliberate, geometric, final. Reaper. Her call sign. The one that lived in classified files so deep that even asking about it would raise flags at the Pentagon. The one only 6 people on Earth should know, and 4 of them were dead. "Where is your father?" Katie's voice didn't waver. That was training. That was 18 years of keeping her face still while everything underneath burned. Still at Mercy General. But he didn't finish. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his eyes went dark. "You need to get dressed. Now. They're sending a car." "Who?" Katie already knew. The moment someone spoke her call sign aloud, the machinery started. Gears that had been waiting, dormant, for someone to pull the trigger. Pentagon liaison. NCIS. They said to tell you it's not a request. By 11:30, Katie sat in the back of a government sedan with 2 NCIS agents whose faces suggested they'd been briefed on exactly who she was. Neither of them spoke. The car pulled into Mercy General's parking lot where crowds of staff were being herded toward the administration wing. Someone had called a mandatory assembly. The kind that happened when something terrible enough required the entire hospital to witness it. Katie's badge, the one that had been deactivated yesterday, was restored by a trembling administrator who wouldn't meet her eyes. She walked through corridors where nurses scattered out of her way. Word traveled. People understood, somehow, that she was no longer the night shift nurse who asked uncomfortable questions about phantom procedures. She was something else now. Something that required security escorts and official channels. The conference room doors opened. Hospital administration lined the walls like a firing squad in business casual. CEO Margaret Chen stood at the head of the table, her expression carved from granite. A Navy SEAL team leader in dress white stood to her right, his uniform a map of decoration, ribbon stacked like geological layers. His eyes found Katie the moment she entered. He saluted. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electronic prayer. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Maria Rodriguez, the SEAL leader said, his voice carrying the weight of formal military address. "It is my honor to present your unredacted service record to these proceedings." He opened a folder. The room held its breath. Bronze Star for Valor. First tour, Ramadi, 2009. A nurse gasped. Her hand went to her mouth. Second Bronze Star. 2010, third Bronze Star. 2011. With each medal, Katie felt the weight of years she'd buried pressing back toward the surface. The accumulated cost of being erased. Navy Cross. Combat heroism and distinguished service. That was when the trembling nurse stood up, her legs unsteady, and had to sit back down. Her hand fumbled for something to hold onto. She knew. She was reading the evidence. She was absorbing the fact that the woman she'd watched being escorted out of this hospital yesterday with a cardboard box containing a dying succulent had saved more lives in Ramadi than most trauma surgeons saw in a lifetime. The SEAL leader's voice cut through the silence. Senior Chief Rodriguez performed emergency field medicine on 17 wounded operators. Under direct fire. With no backup. With nothing but training and will. Katie didn't move. Her composure held like ballast. She'd learned long ago that accepting credit and accepting the weight were two different things. She was officially erased from all DoD databases in 2015 following Operation Whisper in Salalah. She was ordered to disappear. The administrator's face had gone the color of clinical latex. Any record of her service was classified above top secret. Any discussion of her deployment would constitute a federal violation. And then the FBI agent stepped forward, a woman with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent her career untangling conspiracies. Dr. Sterling's Medicare fraud investigation has now identified 17 patient cases. 17 cases of inflated medication charges, phantom procedures, and billing for services never rendered. She opened her own folder. The sound of papers sliding onto the table was like a judge's gavel. We have testimony from nurses, from billing administrators, from families who questioned charges they received. 17 witnesses. She paused. The preliminary estimate of fraud, $847,000 over 34 months. CEO Chen's jaw tightened. Dr. Sterling's hospital privileges are revoked effective immediately. He is being referred to federal prosecutors for charges of wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and filing false claims. The room shifted. Conversations erupted. But Katie's attention was elsewhere. The door had opened. Security guard Miller walked in, carrying a cardboard box identical to the one Katie had carried out yesterday. He was walking toward the administrator's office. Toward Sterling. Katie didn't see it happen, but she heard it. The sound of a door closing. The unmistakable quality of finality. When Miller emerged 20 minutes later, his face was the same professional blank it always was. He carried the box still, now heavier. He'd placed Sterling's diploma inside, his framed photographs, his coffee mug with the hospital logo. The same ritual of erasure, performed in reverse. Later, Katie would hear through the nurses' network, the one that moved information faster than official channels, that Miller had said only one thing as he handed Sterling the box: "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." The same words he'd spoken to Katie yesterday, his voice professional and kind. The same words that meant you were done. That you were finished. That the system had decided you didn't belong here anymore. Sterling walked out through the same corridors Katie had walked. Past the break room where people fell silent. Past room for 12 where Major Carson was sitting up, talking to his son, his color returned, his breathing steady. The Major looked up. He saw Sterling in the hallway. His eyes were the kind of cold that came from understanding exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. Sterling didn't linger. By evening, Katie stood in the ICU at 2245 wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 18 months. The uniform hung slightly loose, she'd lost weight standing at rain-soaked bus stops, carrying cardboard boxes containing the pieces of a life she thought was over. But the ribbons were still there. The decoration still accurate. The evidence that she'd been real, that her service had mattered, that the erasure had been administrative not actual. Major Carson's son approached her near the medication station. "Senior Chief, my father would like to thank you." Katie moved toward room for 12. The Major was sitting up, color in his face, the ventilator tubes long removed. When he saw her, he extended his hand. "I served with your son," he said. 2 months ago. Forward operating base. He talked about his mother who pulled operators out of Ramadi. His grip was firm. A soldier's grip. He told me you were the best he'd ever seen. Coolest under fire. Best hands. He said you brought people home. Katie's eyes filled, but she maintained position, maintained bearing. "Just doing the job, sir." "No," Major Carson said. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood sacrifice because he lived inside it. "You were doing what heroes do. Coming through hell to bring people home." 6 months dissolved like water. Katie's son rotated back to the States in September, stationed at Camp Lejeune, 2 hours' drive from Norfolk. One afternoon in November, a package arrived at her apartment. Inside was a printed photograph. Dr. Sterling stood in front of a community college classroom in Richmond, teaching CPR to 18 bored community college students. His hairline had receded further. His smile was forced. The caption on the back, in her son's handwriting, "Thought you'd want to see Karma's work. Hospital privileges denied in 4 states. This is his new career. Love you, Mom." Katie placed the photograph in a drawer. Next to it, she placed her combat boots, the worn ones that had carried her through Ramadi, the one she'd kept locked in her car like a secret, the one she could finally set on a shelf in her office because she wasn't erased anymore. She wasn't disappeared. She was Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Maria Rodriguez, and the world could see it now. When she walked the ICU corridors at night, patients didn't know her rank. They only knew her hands were steady, that her voice was calm, that she moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd learned medicine in the worst conditions and refused to forget. They knew she could save them, though they'd never understand all the ways she'd already died to learn how. By 0300 on a Tuesday night, the same shift where Sterling had humiliated her 6 months earlier, a Marine arrived in the trauma bay with a severed femoral artery. The ER doctor was panicking. The surgical team was 15 minutes out. Blood loss was exponential. "I've got this," Katie said. Her hands moved with muscle memory, with the same precision that had saved Major Carson, that had saved 12 operators in Ramadi under fire, that had carried her through a career that officially never happened. By 0400, the Marine was stable. Core temperature rising. Sinus rhythm. O2 sat climbing toward normal. She stepped outside for air. The November sky held stars, the kind that only appeared when everything else fell quiet. Her phone buzzed. A text from her son, 2 time zones away, "Proud of you, Mom. Always have been." She texted back, "Proud of you too. Come home safe." She walked back inside to the work that continued, to the quiet hours where the heroes were people nobody noticed, where the bravest warriors carried stethoscopes instead of guns, where sometimes the only reward was knowing you'd done the impossible and someone got to wake up tomorrow because you did. And if you're watching this, if any of this resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, or if you've ever doubted whether your quiet strength was enough, hit that subscribe button. Like this video. And tell me in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Because Katie's story is real in all the ways that matter. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.